The forest was deathly silent, save for the crunch of dry leaves beneath his boots. Ethan's rifle felt heavy in his hands as he moved cautiously through the dense undergrowth, every step bringing him deeper into enemy territory. The mission was supposed to be routine: scout the outskirts, report any alien activity, and fall back to the base. But things had gone wrong, fast. He was cut off from his unit, and now all he could do was follow his training, survive and regroup. As he pushed through the low-hanging branches, something in the clearing ahead caught his eye. The figure slumped against a boulder, barely visible in the dim twilight filtering through the canopy above. At first glance, he thought it was just debris, an alien suit abandoned in the chaos. But then he saw the movement. A shallow, struggling breath. Ethan froze, his heart pounding. It was one of them. Her alien form was different from the others he had fought in battle. The angular armor was cracked and smeared with dirt, and glowing green blood seeped through several jagged wounds along her torso. The aliens, Xerenians, were known for their ruthlessness. They were efficient killers, relentless soldiers. Yet, as Ethan stared down at her battered figure, all he could see was a creature on the edge of death, her wide black eyes reflecting pain and something else. Was it fear or hope? She was trying to say something, her lips trembling, but the alien language was foreign to him, just clicks and soft hums that meant nothing. Ethan's mind raced. Every instinct screamed at him to walk away. No, run, and leave her to die. This was war, and in war, mercy could get you killed. But he hesitated. Why had they left her behind? Xerenians didn't abandon their own. At least not unless the soldier was deemed useless or worse, a liability. Had she been betrayed by her people? His fingers tightened on the strap of his rifle. He could already hear the commanding voice of his superior officer in his head. Leave no survivors, especially not them. But Ethan was never one to follow orders blindly. He crouched beside her, scanning the area. If the aliens were tracking her, they could be close by. He had to act fast. Her gaze locked onto his, and in that brief moment, Ethan felt something shift inside him. It wasn't pity. No, it was deeper than that. It was the simple recognition of another life hanging in the balance. She didn't look like a monster or a threat. She just looked scared. Ethan cursed under his breath and slung his rifle over his shoulder. With quick, practiced hands, he unzipped his med kit and began inspecting her wounds. "You better not make me regret this," he muttered, as if she could understand. The injuries were severe, deep gashes in her side, likely from plasma fire. He fumbled through the kit, finding a coagulant spray and applying it to the worst of the wounds. She winced, her body twitching weakly, but she didn't fight him. "That's it," Ethan murmured, his voice surprisingly gentle. "Just stay with me." He pulled out a field bandage and wrapped it tightly around her torso, the alien blood staining his hands as he worked. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of the choice he was making. If anyone found out he had helped a Xerenian, there would be consequences, severe ones. He glanced around nervously. The jungle was too exposed. They wouldn't last long if her people came back. "You can't stay here," he whispered, more to himself than to her. She opened her mouth, trying to speak again, but the sound was weak. A soft, melodic hum that faded into a shallow breath. Ethan knew he didn't have much time. He needed to find shelter, somewhere safe to tend to her wounds before it was too late. With a grunt of effort, he slipped his arms under her, lifting her off the ground. She was lighter than he expected, but the awkward shape of her armor made it difficult to carry her. Her head rested limply against his chest, and for a moment, Ethan thought she had lost consciousness. "Hang in there," he whispered. He trudged through the forest, his boots sinking into the damp earth with every step. The weight of her fragile form in his arms made each movement slow and deliberate. Ethan's muscles ached, but he kept moving, pushing past exhaustion and fear. He had to find shelter, somewhere, Anywhere. After what felt like hours but was likely only minutes, he stumbled upon a narrow cave entrance hidden behind a curtain of vines. It was small, barely more than a crack in the rock, but it would have to do. He slipped inside, the cool air of the cave wrapping around them like a shroud. Gently, Ethan set her down on the cave floor and leaned her against the wall. Her breathing was shallow, but steady. He reached for his canteen, pouring a small amount of water onto a cloth and dabbing it against her forehead. "Don't you die on me," he muttered, more to himself than to her. In the dim light of the cave, he could see the exhaustion etched into her features. She wasn't just injured, she was drained, as if she had been running for days. Ethan sat back, his mind racing with questions. Why had she been abandoned? What had happened to her unit? And most importantly, why had he chosen to save her? He glanced at the mouth of the cave, half expecting to see enemy soldiers storming through. But there was only silence, broken occasionally by the distant rustle of leaves in the wind. For now, they were safe. But how long would that last? Ethan leaned his head back against the cold stone wall, closing his eyes for just a moment. He was exhausted, his body itching from the weight of the decisions he had made, and the ones that still lay ahead. The alien stirred beside him, her soft hums filling the quiet space between them. Ethan opened his eyes and looked at her, meeting her gaze once more. In her eyes he saw the flicker of something unexpected. Not fear, not hope. Trust. And in that moment, Ethan knew there was no turning back. The cave was cold and damp, the silence stretching between them like an invisible wall. Ethan knelt beside the alien girl, his hands brushing against her cracked armor as he checked the makeshift bandage. She stirred faintly, her breath shallow and uneven. "You're still hanging in there, huh?" Ethan whispered, mostly to himself. The coagulant spray was holding, but the bleeding hadn't fully stopped. He knew she wouldn't survive without proper medical care, and soon. The small med kit he carried wouldn't be enough to fix this. As he rummaged through the rest of his gear, she stirred again. Her large, black eyes fluttered open, and for a moment, their gazes locked. Ethan felt a strange pang in his chest. She looked fragile, not like the cold-blooded killer the war propaganda always portrayed her kind to be. Her lips moved, forming a series of soft clicks and hums, her native language. "I don't understand," Ethan murmured, frustration bubbling under his breath. "You need to rest. Talking isn't gonna help." The alien blinked slowly, as if trying to make sense of his words. She tried to lift a hand, but barely managed to raise it an inch before it dropped weakly to her side. Ethan frowned, glancing at the faint glow from the mouth of the cave. He didn't have time to sit here and play translator. If the Zerenians were looking for her, they wouldn't be far behind. And if his own people found out he was sheltering an alien, he'd be court-martialed at best, and shot at worst. He reached into his pack, pulling out the last ration bar he had left. It wasn't much, but it was all he had. Breaking it in half, he held a piece up to her. "Here, eat this," he said softly. Her head tilted slightly, her dark eyes narrowing in confusion. Slowly, cautiously, she reached out with trembling fingers and took the ration bar. She sniffed it once, then took a small, hesitant bite. "There you go," Ethan said, watching her closely. "See? Not poison." The hint of a smile tugged at the corner of his lips, but it vanished as quickly as it came. This was insane. He was feeding an enemy soldier, an alien, no less, while the rest of his unit was likely fighting and dying somewhere out in the jungle. He shook his head, trying to push the doubts away. He couldn't explain why he was doing this. Maybe it was because she'd been abandoned, left to die by her own kind. Maybe it was because, in some strange way, she reminded him of himself. Alone, cut off, just trying to survive. Or maybe, deep down, he was just tired of the killing. The alien girl finished the small piece of food and let her head rest against the cool stone wall. She muttered something softly in her native language. An apology, maybe. "Thank you." Ethan couldn't be sure. "Rest," he told her, his voice low and steady. "We'll figure this out later." She gave a faint nod, her eyelids drooping as exhaustion pulled her under. Ethan watched her for a moment longer, then stood and moved toward the entrance of the cave. He peered through the curtain of vines, scanning the dark jungle beyond. So far, there was no sign of pursuit, but that didn't mean they were safe. Ethan exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand down his face. He was running on fumes, every muscle in his body aching from the trek through the forest. But rest wasn't an option, not yet. He turned back toward the alien girl, glancing at her slumped form against the wall. His mind raced with questions. What was her story? Why had her own people left her to die? And most importantly, what the hell was he going to do with her? The thought gnawed at him as he sat down on the opposite side of the cave, resting his back against the cold stone. He knew he couldn't stay here long. The Zerenians would be searching for her, and if they found him with one of their own, well, things wouldn't end well. And if his own people found him, he'd be branded a traitor. Ethan closed his eyes for just a second, letting the exhaustion wash over him. The jungle was eerily quiet, the only sound the occasional drip of water from the cave ceiling. Then, out of the silence, a distant noise reached his ears, a faint, mechanical hum. His eyes snapped open, every muscle in his body tensing. It was the unmistakable sound of a search drone. "Damn it," Ethan muttered under his breath. He scrambled to his feet, grabbing his rifle and slinging it over his shoulder. The alien stirred, her eyes flickering open as if sensing the danger. "Time to move," Ethan whispered urgently. She struggled to sit up, her movements sluggish and uncoordinated. Ethan knelt beside her, slipping his arm under her shoulder to help her to her feet. She leaned heavily against him, her body trembling with the effort of standing. I know," Ethan muttered, "but we've got to go." With a grunt of effort, he half carried, half dragged her toward the back of the cave. There had to be another way out. Tunnel. A passage. Something. The mechanical hum grew louder, closer. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he scanned the walls of the cave, searching for anything that looked like an exit. Then he saw it, a narrow crack in the far wall, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. "Come on," he whispered, pulling the alien girl toward the crack. She stumbled, nearly collapsing, but Ethan held her steady. Together, they squeezed through the narrow opening, the cold stone scraping against their skin and armor. On the other side was a narrow tunnel that stretched into darkness. Ethan flicked on the small flashlight, attached to his rifle, the beam cutting through the gloom. "This way," he said, more to himself than to her. The alien girl gave a faint nod, her dark eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. Ethan tightened his grip on her arm and led her deeper into the tunnel, the sound of the drone fading behind them. They walked in silence, the weight of their situation pressing down on them with every step. Ethan's mind raced, trying to formulate a plan, but nothing made sense. All he knew was that, somehow, he had to keep her alive. And that was just the beginning. Ethan's flashlight flickered as they made their way through the narrow tunnel, the beam slicing through the inky darkness. Every step felt heavier, each breath harder to catch in the stale air that filled the cave system. He kept one hand on the alien girl's arm, guiding her through the jagged terrain. She leaned heavily against him, her breathing labored but steady enough to keep moving. The silence between them stretched on, broken only by the occasional scrape of boots against stone or the distant plink of water dripping from above. Ethan's mind churned with half-formed plans. How long they could stay ahead of the search drones, whether the tunnel would lead to an exit, what to do if it didn't. "Just a little further," Ethan whispered, though he wasn't sure who he was trying to reassure, her or himself. The alien girl gave a faint hum in response, a tired sound that somehow conveyed both trust and exhaustion. Ethan glanced at her as they stumbled forward. She was on the verge of collapse, her body trembling from exertion and blood loss. The coagulant spray was only a temporary fix, Without real medical treatment, she wouldn't last much longer. Ethan gritted his teeth. He couldn't let her die here, not after everything. The tunnel sloped downward, the path twisting and narrowing until they had to crouch to avoid hitting their heads on the low ceiling. The flashlight flickered again, and Ethan smacked it against his palm in frustration. "Don't do this to me now," he muttered to the dying light. It stayed on, though barely, casting weak shadows on the rocky walls. They continued deeper into the cave, the oppressive silence weighing heavier with every step. Ethan knew the risk of going deeper. If the tunnel didn't lead anywhere, they'd be trapped. No backup, no supplies, no way out. But staying where they were wasn't an option either, not with the drones overhead and search parties likely scouring the jungle. He had to believe this tunnel would lead somewhere, anywhere. The alien stumbled again, nearly dragging Ethan down with her. He tightened his grip on her arm and pulled her upright, his muscles burning from the effort. "Easy," Ethan murmured, his voice softer than he intended. "I've got you." She made a sound, low hum that could have been gratitude, or maybe just exhaustion. It was hard to tell. They pressed on, each step feeling more like a battle against time and fatigue. Ethan's legs ached, his shoulders screamed from the weight of his pack, and his throat was dry from the stale air. But he didn't stop, couldn't stop. Eventually, the tunnel widened into a small chamber, the ceiling arching high above them. In the dim light of his flashlight, Ethan spotted a shallow pool of water glimmering at the far end of the chamber. Relief washed over him. Water. It wasn't much, but it was something. "Come on," he whispered, half dragging the alien girl toward the pool. He lowered her carefully onto the cool stone floor, then knelt beside the water and filled his canteen. The water was murky but smelled fresh enough. Ethan took a tentative sip. It was bitter and metallic, but drinkable. He filled the canteen again and brought it to the alien girl's lips. "Here, drink." She blinked slowly, her dark eyes hazy with exhaustion, but she managed to take a few sips. Ethan watched her carefully, ready to pull the canteen away if she choked. But she swallowed the water without issue, her breathing evening out just a little. "That's it," Ethan murmured, relieved. "Keep going." She took another sip, then slumped back against the stone wall, her eyes fluttering shut. Ethan sat back on his heels, running a hand through his sweat-damp hair. They had a little time now, not much, but enough to catch their breath. He leaned against the wall beside her, the cool stone pressing into his back. For a few moments, he let himself relax, just a little. The weight of the day's events settled over him like a heavy blanket, and exhaustion tugged at the edges of his consciousness. But he couldn't afford to sleep, not yet. The alien stirred beside him, her eyes opening just a sliver. She muttered something, soft clicks and hums that Ethan didn't understand. But there was no fear in her voice this time, just tiredness. And maybe trust. Ethan tilted his head, studying her in the dim light. Her features were strange, angular and sharp, with skin that shimmered faintly like polished stone. But there was something familiar in the way she looked at him, something almost human. He shook the thought away. It didn't matter what she looked like. She was still an enemy soldier. His Iranian. And yet, Ethan sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. This wasn't supposed to happen. He wasn't supposed to care. But here they were. "You better not get any ideas," he muttered, glancing at her. "I'm not exactly a hero." The alien girl gave a faint hum, a sound that might have been amusement. Ethan snorted softly. "Yeah, laugh it up." For a moment, the tension lifted, and the heavy weight on his chest eased just a little. It didn't last long, but it was enough. Enough to remind him that maybe not everything had to be about survival. Maybe there was room for something more, even out here. The thought scared him more than he cared to admit. Ethan shook his head, clearing the thought from his mind. He needed to focus. They weren't out of the woods yet. Not by a long shot. He stood slowly, stretching his stiff muscles, and scanned the chamber for any sign of another exit. The tunnel they had come through was the only way in or out. If anyone was following them, they'd be trapped here. Ethan's stomach twisted at the thought. He needed a plan, and fast. "We can't stay here," he muttered, more to himself than to her. The alien girl gave a weak nod, as if agreeing with him. Ethan glanced down at her, surprised by the gesture. It was such a small thing, but it felt significant, like a silent agreement between them, a promise to keep going together. Ethan slung his rifle over his shoulder and crouched beside her, slipping his arm under her shoulder to help her up. "Let's move," he whispered. The alien girl leaned heavily against him, but she didn't resist. Together, they made their way toward the entrance of the chamber, their footsteps echoing softly in the darkness. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as they slipped back into the narrow tunnel, the weight of their situation pressing down on him with every step. But for the first time since this nightmare began, he didn't feel so alone. And neither did she. They moved slowly, every step in the cramped tunnel draining what little energy they had left. Ethan kept a tight grip on the alien girl, her weight heavy against his side. Her breathing was shallow, but she kept moving, barely. He could feel her trembling, her legs threatening to give out at any moment. "We're almost there," Ethan muttered, though he had no idea if that was true. The tunnel seemed endless, twisting through the mountain like an ancient scar. The flashlight flickered again, the beam growing dimmer with each passing second. Ethan clenched his jaw, smacking the light against his palm. "Come on, just a little longer." The light steadied, but its weak glow didn't inspire much confidence. They had to find an exit soon, or they'd be trapped here, deep underground with no way out. And that wasn't even the worst of their problems. The low hum of search drones echoed faintly from the tunnel behind them. Ethan's heart jumped. The Xerenians weren't giving up. They were hunting them, her. And if they were caught together, Ethan doubted he'd be offered a chance to explain himself. "Move faster," he urged her, tugging her forward. The alien girl stumbled but managed to stay on her feet, her arms slung over his shoulders for support. Her breath hitched, and she let out a soft, frustrated hum, half a complaint, half an apology. "Yeah, I know," Ethan muttered, not exactly having a great time myself. They pushed on, the air growing colder and damper as the tunnel narrowed. Ethan's boots slipped on the slick stone floor, and he tightened his grip on her, steadying them both. His pulse pounded in his ears, each beat a reminder that they were running out of time. Then, just as his hope began to wane, the tunnel widened. Faint moonlight filtered through a crack in the ceiling, casting pale beams across the rocky floor. Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. There. He guided the alien girl toward the light, his eyes scanning the chamber for an exit. But as they reached the center of the space, a faint click echoed from behind them. A mechanical sound, cold and deliberate. Ethan froze. "Don't move," a voice called from the shadows. Ethan's blood ran cold. Slowly, he turned his head, his heart sinking as three figures stepped into the moonlight. Xerenian soldiers. Their armor glinted in the pale light, weapons drawn and aimed directly at him. The alien girl tensed beside Ethan, her breath hitching in fear. One of the soldiers barked something in their language, a harsh command that Ethan couldn't understand. But he didn't need a translator to know they weren't here for a friendly chat. Ethan's hand tightened around the grip of his rifle, but he didn't raise it. He knew he wouldn't survive a shootout, not with her barely standing beside him and three soldiers ready to pull the trigger. The lead soldier, taller than the others, with deep scars etched into his armor, stepped forward, his weapon trained on Ethan. He spoke again, his voice sharp and commanding. Ethan's mind raced. If he made a move, they'd be dead in seconds. But if he did nothing... The alien girl stirred beside him, her eyes locking onto the lead soldier. She muttered something, soft and urgent, her voice carrying an edge of desperation. The soldier hesitated, his weapon lowering slightly as he responded in their language, his tone laced with suspicion. Ethan glanced at her, trying to read the expression on her alien features. Was she negotiating? Pleading for their lives? The lead soldier barked another command, and the other two soldiers stepped forward, their weapons still raised. Ethan's heart pounded. This was it. They were out of options. But then, without warning, the alien girl did something Ethan didn't expect. She pulled away from him, just enough to raise her hands in a gesture that seemed universal. The gesture of surrender. Ethan's stomach twisted. What the hell are you doing? She shot him a glance, just a flicker of her dark eyes, but it was enough to make him pause. There was a quiet determination in her gaze, a silent message he couldn't quite decipher. Before he could stop her, she stepped forward, speaking rapidly in her native language. The soldiers hesitated, glancing at each other uncertainly. The lead soldier tilted his head, his weapon lowering just slightly. Ethan's mind raced. She's trying to buy time. He could see it now, the way she positioned herself between him and the soldiers, protecting him in the only way she knew how. It was a gamble, and it might just work. Ethan took a slow step back, his eyes scanning the chamber for any way out. There, a narrow passage to the left, almost hidden in the shadows. If they could make it to that passage. The alien girl kept talking, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. The soldiers seemed unsure, their weapons wavering slightly. Ethan knew he had to move. Now. Without another word, he grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the hidden passage. She stumbled but didn't resist, her body moving in sync with his. The soldiers shouted behind them, but Ethan didn't look back. He dragged her into the narrow passage, his heart pounding in his chest. The tunnel twisted and turned, the walls closing in around them like the ribs of some ancient beast. They ran, or rather, Ethan half ran, half dragged her through the tight space, the sound of pursuit close behind. His muscles screamed in protest, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the passage opened into a larger cavern. Ethan staggered to a halt, gasping for breath. The alien girl collapsed beside him, her chest heaving as she fought to catch her breath. They were alive, for now. Ethan leaned against the wall, his lungs burning, his mind racing. They'd bought themselves a little time. But how long before the soldiers caught up? He glanced at the alien girl, who lay sprawled on the ground beside him, her eyes half closed. She looked exhausted, but there was a flicker of something else in her gaze, something Ethan hadn't seen before. Trust. And maybe hope. Ethan exhaled slowly, running a hand through his sweat-soaked hair. They weren't out of the woods yet, but at least they were still alive. And as long as they were alive, there was a chance to escape, a chance to survive, maybe even a chance to change everything. The cavern walls closed around them like the jaws of a beast, the air heavy with dampness and tension. Ethan leaned his head against the cool stone, trying to slow his breathing. His chest ached with every breath, his muscles burning from the sprint. The alien girl lay beside him, her body trembling from exhaustion. Her eyes fluttered closed, but she forced them open again, as if afraid to surrender to sleep. Ethan knew the feeling well. Out here, sleep was just another way to die. He shook his canteen and cursed under his breath. Barely a few drops left. They couldn't stay here much longer. Sooner or later, the soldiers would find this place. They always did. Stay with me, Ethan whispered, nudging the alien girl gently. We've got to move soon. She hummed softly, a sound that could have meant anything. But Ethan chose to believe it was agreement. She shifted slightly, her hand brushing against his arm. It was such a small gesture, but it carried a weight that Ethan couldn't ignore. We're in this together. The thought unsettled him. He had never expected to find himself depending on an alien, let alone protecting one. But something about her, something in the way she looked at him, made it impossible to walk away. He pulled his rifle closer, checking the remaining charge. Not much left. If it came to a fight, they wouldn't last long. He scanned the cavern, searching for another exit. The tunnel they had come through was their only way out, but it wouldn't be safe for long. Ethan clenched his jaw. They needed a plan. Fast. Think, Ethan. Think, he muttered to himself. The alien girl stirred beside him, drawing his attention. Her dark eyes glimmered faintly in the dim light, and she tilted her head toward him. As if sensing his frustration, she clicked her mandibles softly. A question. Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. I don't know. I don't have a plan. The alien girl hummed again, a strange sound that carried a note of sympathy. Ethan found himself snorting quietly in amusement. Yeah, laugh it up. Real comforting. She shifted, sitting up with effort. Her gaze flickered toward his rifle, then back to him. Slowly, she reached for the small device strapped to her armor. A communication unit. Ethan's pulse quickened. Whoa, whoa. What are you doing? He whispered, grabbing her hand. The alien girl paused, her gaze steady and calm. She pointed at the device, then at him, clicking her mandibles softly in a way that almost sounded reassuring. Ethan frowned. You want to use that thing? No way. That'll just bring them right to us. She shook her head, clicking again. Softer, more deliberate sound. Ethan hesitated, his mind racing. Was she trying to tell him something? Slowly, she turned the device toward him and tapped on the screen. Symbols lit up, alien glyphs that meant nothing to Ethan. But she pointed to one of them repeatedly, her gaze locked on his. What is that? Ethan whispered, squinting at the glowing glyph. The alien girl hummed softly, then mimicked the sound of a distress signal. High-pitched chirps, followed by a pause. Ethan's eyes widened. You're sending a false signal. She nodded, her mandibles clicking in confirmation. Ethan stared at her, trying to wrap his head around the idea. A false distress signal. If it worked, it could lure the soldiers away from their location. But if it didn't? Ethan exhaled slowly. That's risky. The alien girl clicked softly. A sound that felt almost like a shrug. Ethan shook his head, a grin tugging at the corner of his mouth despite the danger. You're insane. She hummed softly in response. The alien girl slumped against the wall, her strength spent. Ethan gave her a small, approving nod. Not bad. You might be smarter than you look. She clicked softly. Amusement, maybe, and Ethan chuckled quietly. Yeah, don't let it go to your head. The drone's hum grew louder, then began to fade, moving deeper into the tunnels, following the false signal. Ethan exhaled slowly, the tension in his chest easing just a little. We bought ourselves some time, he muttered, more to himself than to her. The alien girl gave a faint hum, her eyes closing briefly. Ethan knew they couldn't afford to rest long, but he let her have this moment. She had earned it. He sat back against the wall, his mind still racing. They had a chance now, a slim one, but a chance nonetheless. If they could find a way out of the caves before the soldiers realized the signal was fake. Ethan shook his head. One problem at a time. For now, they were alive, and that was more than he had expected. Ethan's muscles screamed as he pulled the alien girl through the narrowing tunnel. The false distress signal had bought them some time, but he knew it wouldn't last. The soldiers would figure out the trick soon enough, and when they did, they'd come back, angrier and more determined than before. The dim light from his dying flashlight flickered again, casting shifting shadows on the stone walls. They had to keep moving. Ethan could feel it in his gut. An exit was close. It had to be. The alien girl stumbled, her body sagging heavily against him. Ethan tightened his grip on her arm, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Not much further, he whispered, though he wasn't sure if he believed it. Her head lolled toward him, her dark eyes half-lidded with exhaustion, But there was still something fierce in her gaze, a determination to survive, despite everything. Ethan pushed forward, his boots scuffing against the uneven ground. The tunnel twisted one final time, and then opened into a larger cavern. Moonlight poured in through a jagged crack high above, illuminating the space in pale silver light. Ethan's heart leaped. "There," he whispered. "That's our way out." The alien girl gave a faint hum, her strength almost gone. Ethan glanced up at the opening. It wasn't wide, but if they could climb to it, they'd be free. He scanned the walls for a way up. Jagged rocks jutted out at odd angles, forming a crude staircase toward the opening. It wouldn't be easy, especially with her in tow, but it was their only chance. "Hang tight," Ethan murmured, adjusting his grip on her. "We're almost there." He started the climb, each step slow and deliberate. The alien girl clung to him weakly, her breath warm against his neck. Ethan's arms burned from the effort, but he didn't stop. Couldn't stop. The sound of pursuit echoed faintly from the tunnels below. Voices, metallic footsteps, the distant hum of a drone. They were running out of time. Ethan gritted his teeth, forcing himself up the last few feet. His fingers scraped against the rocky ledge, and with a final burst of strength, he pulled himself and her up through the opening. They tumbled onto the forest floor outside, gasping for breath. The night air was cool and sharp, the scent of damp earth filling Ethan's lungs. For a moment, he just lay there, too exhausted to move. But they weren't safe yet. He rolled onto his side, helping the alien girl sit up. She leaned heavily against him, her body trembling with fatigue. Ethan scanned the dark forest around them, listening for any sign of pursuit. Silence. They had made it. For the first time since the nightmare began, Ethan allowed himself to breathe. They were out. They were alive. But what now? Ethan sat back against a tree. The alien girl slumped beside him. The cool night air wrapped around them, and for a brief moment, everything felt still, quiet. But the question still gnawed at the edges of Ethan's mind. What happened next? What would he do with her? And what would she do with him? He glanced down at the small communication device still strapped to her armor. They could call for help, either from her people or his. But both options carried risks. If the Xerenians found them, Ethan would be taken prisoner, or worse. If his own people found them, well, aiding the enemy wouldn't exactly go over well. The alien girl shifted beside him, her dark eyes flickering open. She looked up at him, her gaze steady and grateful. "Why?" she whispered, her voice rough and heavily accented, but clear. Ethan blinked, caught off guard by the question. "Why what?" She tilted her head slightly, her gaze unwavering. "Why help me?" Ethan exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. He had asked himself the same question 100 times since he first saw her, bleeding and broken in that jungle. "Because," he said quietly, "it was the right thing to do." The alien girl studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, slowly, she nodded. "Thank you." The words were simple, but they carried a weight that Ethan felt deep in his chest. He gave her a small, tired smile. "Don't mention it." She hummed softly, a sound that might have been amusement. Ethan chuckled quietly, surprised by how easy it felt to laugh, even in the middle of a war zone. He leaned his head back against the tree, his mind turning over the possibilities. They couldn't stay here forever. Sooner or later, they'd have to make a choice. The alien girl shifted, glancing at the communication device on her arm. She hesitated, then looked at Ethan, as if waiting for permission. Ethan frowned, his mind racing. If they sent a signal now, they'd have to trust whoever answered it, whether it was her people or his. There was no guarantee of safety, no way to know what would happen next. But maybe trust was all they had left. Ethan nodded slowly. "Do it." The alien girl tapped the device, her fingers moving quickly over the screen. A faint chirp echoed through the night as the signal went out, disappearing into the vast expanse of stars overhead. They sat in silence, waiting. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, every second heavy with uncertainty. But for the first time, he didn't feel afraid. The alien girl leaned against him, her breathing slow and even. Ethan glanced down at her, a strange sense of peace settling over him. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. And maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to end this war. In the distance, the faint hum of an approaching ship echoed through the night sky. Ethan tensed, his hand instinctively reaching for his rifle. The alien girl placed a hand on his arm, her touch light but reassuring. Ethan exhaled slowly, forcing himself to relax. The ship descended through the trees, its lights flickering through the leaves. Ethan and the alien girl exchanged a glance, a silent promise. They had made it this far. And whatever came next, they would face it side by side. The ship's hatch hissed open, and a figure stepped out. Human, Zerenian, or something else entirely. Ethan didn't know. But for the first time in a long time, he felt something close to hope.